Welcome back to La Pausa, a Pints and Punditry podcast here at the Pitchside Pub. It is Monday, April 1st. I don't like April Fool's Day, so we're not going to do anything anywhere remotely related to that stupid holiday. Not a holiday. But we are back with episode 19 of our podcast, and today we're going to talk about the weekend that was, particularly in the Premier League, where we got a little more clarity on the race and a lot of reactions to the Man City Arsenal game, some of which are really, really stupid. So we're going to dive into that and take a look at the stubbornness of managers and ask the question that I have talked about before: how much possession is too much possession? Because it does appear that there is a threshold at which having possession can actually be a detriment, and I think we are seeing that with Manchester City. So that's what we're going to talk about today on the episode. But before we get into it, hit that subscribe button for me down below. Make sure you follow the channel. Get in that comment section what you think about Arsenal, about Liverpool, about Man City, about the tactics of this game and tactics in general. I would love to hear your comments. And of course, if you don't already, go ahead and follow us on Twitter at PitchsidePub. So, you know, the main response from most fans to the Manchester City Arsenal game on Sunday was that it was a boring dud of a game. And, you know, the first thing I have to say is that it is not the responsibility of any team or any manager to entertain you. Now, sports are an entertainment business, so it does help, certainly helps TV ratings when the game is entertaining and you see rules and these footballing organizations constantly changing rules to make the game more exciting, and that is directly because of television. But just because this was the game of the week or the month or the season perhaps does not mean that the managers have any obligation to make it a wide open game for your entertainment value. So you can call it a dud all you want, but this is two of the best managers in the world, and they decided that this was the best way to play their game. And really it was Arsenal that slowed this game down. Manchester City had the ball the whole time, and Arsenal fell into a deep block and let them come deep into their territory, tilted the field that way. So it's not like Pep and Manchester City could have played any more out on the front foot than they already did. They had 78% possession, had 12 shots on goal. They couldn't have been a whole lot more out on the front foot. It's really Arsenal that dictated the pace of this game by making no attempt really to get the ball. And their traditional, their very effective, typically high press was virtually non-existent. Even when Manchester City had the ball deep in their own territory, they sort of, faked a little high press and they put some sort of faint pressure on City's back line, but they didn't really show a whole lot of interest in pressing high. And I get it. I understand the tactic by Mikel Arteta, because that's what would have opened things up for Kevin De Bruyne and Erling Haaland. And by just packing the box, those two really can't do the things that they do best, which is something we're going to talk about in a little bit. So I understand the tactics from Mikel Arteta. Now, you can argue that he played for the draw, not the win, and you can argue that that was not the right strategy, although I think there are arguments on both sides. We are talking about what has become an incredibly tough place to play at Manchester City. And this was the first team to hold them scoreless at home in 50-some-odd games. I forget the exact number, 53, 57, something like that. It was a ton of games. It's been a long time since they have not scored at home. And it takes this level of commitment to defense and this sort of sacrificing of your offense to pull that off. And so, if Mikel Arteta said, listen, it is really going to be hard to outscore them and in order to do that, we are going to expose ourselves, right? If we are going to try and outscore Manchester City at home, we are going to leave ourselves exposed and thus allow their best players to do what they do. So let's change it up, take away their best players, which is Erling Haaland and Kevin De Bruyne. Let's take away the things they do best, and we'll see if we can steal one on a counterattack. And they did have some good looks. In fact, you could argue that they had some better looks than Manchester City did, despite massively fewer attempts. I think it was 2 shots on goal for Arsenal to 12 shots overall for Manchester City, but only 1 on goal. So you can argue that that Arteta and Arsenal had better looks on goal than Manchester City. But that wasn't really, that was icing on the cake. That was the cherry on top, was maybe we'll steal a goal on a counterattack, or a defender slips, or somebody screws up. But they were happy to just keep their clean sheet and get out of there with a point. Now that benefits Liverpool, but you could see that Arteta had looked ahead on the schedule and pinpointed that this was a time when 1 point was okay. And there are other opportunities to get 3 points, but by going for 3 here, we run the risk of getting 0 and taking ourselves out of it altogether. Again, if you want to counter argue that against that philosophy, by all means, I think there are arguments as to why that was too passive, but I do get it. I understand it, and I don't know that it was the wrong approach, but there were a lot of different options here. So I understand why Arteta went about this the way he did. The issue, and part of why this was such a not as entertaining of a game as it could have been for neutrals, was because of Pep Guardiola's stubbornness. And listen, you won't find me knocking Pep Guardiola. He is the best manager in the world. It is not close. He has been for a long time, and I am so fortunate that he is the manager of the club I support. So this is not me by any stretch knocking Pep or thinking I know more than him by any stretch of the imagination. Just that's not what's happening here. However, the more I watch this game, and not just this game between Manchester City and Arsenal, but the game of football in general, the more it becomes evident to me that there is definitely such thing as having too much possession. And what I mean by that is, use this game as an example. And I talked about this in a couple weeks ago in regards to the U.S. men's national team when they barely got away with a win against Jamaica. And Jamaica got an early goal, and then they just packed the box into it was like a 4-6 defense, right? It was just crowd the box as much as possible. And the USA eventually broke through because they were superior, talent-wise. They were just so much more talented than the Jamaican team out there. And that's what Manchester City have done. Every team in the league knows, okay, well, we gotta have a low block, pack the box, and hope for the best, and hope we can fend them off, and maybe we get a counterattack, but maybe we get out of here with a draw. And most teams have tried that against City this year. And Pep has really not changed up his tactics, because against most teams, their talent will win out. Against the Brentfords, against the Sheffields, against the Burnleys, against Burnley tries to actually have possession. Credit to Vincent Kompany. It's not working very well, but they at least try. They're a bad example. Against the Fulhams, against the all these other clubs that really are not going to out talent Manchester City. They just lie back and they lie deep in their zone and they pack it in. But eventually Manchester City's talent wins out. You get a blast outside the box from Rodri, or Haaland slips through, or they sneak one in on a corner, or Phil Foden does something magical. But again, a lot of these shots have come from the top of the box, right? They're at their most deadly when they get out open and play and get numbers, and Erling Haaland can find space. And for those knocking Erling Haaland and for those that want to call him a tap-in specialist, you're really showing your lack of football education. Now, Erling Haaland is not as complete of a player as it would be nice if he was, because in games like this where you pack the box in, you really can take him out of it. You can really take him out of it because he's not great in tight spaces, because he's so big and tall and he's got long levers, and he's okay with the ball for a guy that size and with his strength, but I wouldn't say he's great in space the way a Foden, the way a Bernardo is, the way even Julian Alvarez is, who did not play. But in these tight spaces, you could argue that he'd be a better option because he's so good with the ball at his feet in a crowd. So you really can take him out of this game. But to call him a tap-in specialist is really an ignorant comment, because you know what it takes to get tap-ins, right? You have to have great positioning. You have to have great feel. You have to be in the spot to tap the damn ball in. That does not happen by accident. Erling Haaland has incredible field awareness. He's incredibly powerful and quick and fast. And so, his tap-ins come from great positioning and from knowing where to be and from spacing. And so to call him a tap-in specialist is really quite ignorant. But his skill set does not play well against strategies like we saw on Sunday, when the box is crowded, he can play some bully ball, and he's great with the header when you can get across to him, but those are low percentage options. He is best when he's got some space because he's just bigger, faster, stronger than everybody else, and he's a good finisher. And the same with Kevin De Bruyne. He is a big guy by football standards, and so in the really tight spaces, obviously he has tremendous dribbling ability, but he is much better when you get him out on the transition and he can make incredible long passes, right? And so you see a lot of the best assists from Kevin De Bruyne come from outside the box into the crowd, but not dribbling in the tight spaces at the top of the box when you're surrounded by 4 or 5 defenders. That's the Bernardo spot, that's the Alvarez spot, that's the Phil Foden spot. The problem is it doesn't work against really good teams. And Arsenal is a really good team with a tremendous defense. And William Saliba is having a Virgil van Dijk-esque type season. He's been phenomenal. And Gabriel yesterday was incredibly good. And that pairing just took Erling Haaland out of it. And they could focus on him because they know City likes to play wide. Arteta knows this. And then they had extra support from Declan Rice and from basically starting 4 center backs. And so there was plenty of help so those two guys could take Erling Haaland out of it. Kevin De Bruyne doesn't have the space to work with. And all of a sudden, City spends all their possession just passing the ball around, and they can't get a good look. And so they had 12 shots on goal. They had 12 shots, but only 1 on target. And for 12 shots, their XG was only 1. It was 1.0 even. And XG obviously has a few flaws, but it's a good general indicator of the scoring opportunities they had, which were few and far between despite all that possession. Meanwhile, Arsenal was 0.7, despite only having 2 shots on goal. So, but that has become a common theme with City. 75% possession. I think it was 78 in this game, or 72-28, or something ridiculous like that. 70+% possession, tons of shots on goal, but no real good opportunities, right? Not a lot of high percentage shots. And that has become the City model. And eventually they get 1 or 2 against lesser teams. But they weren't going to get that against William Saliba and Gabriel. Those guys are just too good, and they're too well coached. Arteta is a fantastic coach. Arsenal fans that were calling for Arteta out earlier in the season, ridiculous. I guarantee you would be downgraded with whoever you replaced him with. Mikel Arteta is a good coach. That team was well disciplined. They knew what their game plan was coming in, and they stuck to it. And so did City, and that's sort of the problem, is Pep is a stubborn guy. And now, while Pep has shown over the years a willingness to make changes to formations, changes to personnel, sometimes he makes changes that haven't really been tested out, and he makes them in the biggest games, and it's infuriating. But this wasn't one of those cases, and he makes these changes, but there's always one overwhelming philosophy that sticks around, one common denominator for Pep, and that is possession. You have to have possession, no matter what formation he has, no matter what shape he runs out there with the guys in. You got wing backs coming forward, you got them coming inverted, you got guys stepping up. It doesn't matter. The common theme is always possession. That is Pep football, and the soccer world has figured out, okay, if you want to have possession, we will give you all the possession in the world. But we're going to pack this box so well that it's almost impossible to do anything with. And this is not new. Guys have been parking the bus for years. This has been going on for decades, but it really is starting to work, and everybody's starting to figure out how to do it against these Pep Guardiola teams. And Mikel Arteta took it a step further, and this is where a guy like Declan Rice was so important in this game, because the best way to combat that low block is for these long, powerful shots at the edge of the box, right? Just maybe 2-3 yards out at the top of the edge of the box. And you could see, especially in the middle part of that game, Rodri was stepping up looking for those shots, and he just couldn't get the space. And when he did, it was typically going to be on his left foot, which isn't as strong. And so they knew that is then the counterattack to that. That's the alternative. That's the second best. Hey, we can't get the nice shot inside the box. We can't get the tap in. The crosses aren't working. We got to go to these shots at the top of the box. They really only tried 1 or 2. Kovacic had one at the early in the second half, but there weren't a lot of those looks because they were stepping up. Arsenal's second line, that midfield line that had dropped back, was really stepping up to prevent those. So they knew what they were ready to do. It was an excellent game plan by Arteta, and Pep played right into it. Pep played right into it because Arteta knows Pep is not going to do anything to give up possession. So he said, fine, here you go, former boss. Here you go, mentor. Take all the possession you want. I trust my defense. And that's not going to work for every club, but it will for the really skilled clubs. The clubs like Liverpool, like Arsenal, not that Liverpool did this, but the clubs with those kinds of defenders, they can do this. And City could have had another 100 minutes, and they might have scored, but they would have given one up at some point too. And so they were not going to outscore Arsenal so long as Arsenal stayed in their low block and held their ground and maintained discipline. And to their credit, they did exactly that. So what is the alternative? At some point, you've got to give up some possession. You've got to open this game up, and Pep has to trust his defense a little bit too. And maybe they need to lay back a little bit because they come up so high when in possession with that high back line. But at some point, you've got to give the ball back to them and bait them out. You've got to test that discipline, right? It's easy for them to stay disciplined when City has the ball in their half the whole time. Of course, they're going to stay in that low block. Where else are they going to go? But they're going to look for those counterattacking opportunities. The five offensive-minded players that are out on the field, they're programmed for that. So if you give them a little bit of space, they are going to go on the attack, and that is the chance for the counterattack. And I argued the same thing with Greg Berhalter and the USA against Jamaica. You've got to bait these guys to come out and test their discipline. And maybe they don't take it. Maybe they don't take it and they just kick it right back to you. But City didn't even try. City did not even try to give them back some possession, because it goes against their DNA. I understand it. Pep probably hates that entire concept, but it's the only way. They could have played 100 more minutes. They weren't going to score against that team, because frankly, they didn't even really come close. They had a couple balls bouncing around that they almost tapped in, but really no cohesive, real attempts on goal in that game for City, despite all that possession. And so possession isn't doing you any good at that point. Possession doesn't mean anything if you can't get decent looks at goal off of it. And that has become the common denominator with City. Now, part of that is they have lost some talent that has not been replaced great, replaced really well. Gundogan, Ilkay Gundogan was a great player in games like this. And he would just find a sloppy goal somewhere and make it happen. A guy like Sergio Aguero, this would have been his kind of game. In tight spaces, ball falls at his feet, and he finds a way through. That's where he excels. This team is built different. This team has, especially when you put Doku and Grealish out on the wings, that team all of a sudden was built to run. I was hoping when those subs came in, which I did not like the substitutions, but if you're going to put them in, you got to open them up. You got to open those guys up and let them run a little bit. You pack them in the box and just make them dribble around. And Jeremy Doku, who can be so dynamic, boy, his first touch was like mine. I mean, it was bad. Which is, again, in tight spaces, that costs them possession. So you've got to find a way to bait the other team out, and maybe 65% possession looks a lot better. Maybe that ends up giving you a lot more opportunities than 72%. You got to get Arsenal out on the break a little bit and see if you can test that discipline. And at some point, Pep is going to have to try that. Again, against these lesser teams, that's fine. You can take the battering ram approach, right? It's like in old movies where you're attacking a medieval castle and you got the battering ram and, yeah, you see us, but we got the big thing and we're just going to keep hitting your door and eventually we're going to get through, right? And eventually it works. Against these good teams, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. It's not tough to see. And I know Pep sees it, but it goes against, so I'm not telling him anything he doesn't know, obviously, but it goes against his ethos. It goes against his DNA. It goes against everything he knows to say, let's have less possession. And I wonder if that's a problem that City is not going to be able to overcome this season because they simply don't have, it's not that they don't have enough talent. They don't have the right talent to overcome that. And Erling Haaland is a problem if that's how they're being forced to play. He is not meant to play in a crowded box like that unless you can flip him some headers. And City's not a huge crossing team because crosses tend to lead to loss of possession and counterattacks if they're not converted. So that's not the strategy. So you've got your two best players, Erling Haaland, Kevin De Bruyne. They are both better in space, and yet there is no space. So you have completely negated what the two best players on the field do the best. And that's the problem that opponents have figured out that City now has to figure out a counterattack to. Now, listen, there's nobody in the world I'd rather figure out a new plan for how to combat this than Pep Guardiola. And I'm not telling anybody anything he hasn't already figured out, right? So this isn't I know better than Pep. Obviously, I do not. But that's the counter move that he's going to have to come up with. The league has figured out how to stop the attack and how to negate his best players, and the really good teams can pull it off. So what does he do next? If a team is willing to get out and run with him, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the Champions League with Real Madrid, because they want to get out and run too. So if they get out and run with City, we could have some real back and forth, and that's going to be like a 4-3 game, right? Because both teams are going to get exposed on the back end. That one will be more fun to watch. But if a team is willing to sit back and load the box, and they have good enough defenders to pull it off, they can stop this City team. And now Pep has to figure out a way to combat that, because that's going to be the recipe. Everybody in the world saw it yesterday, and it was already evident. We'd already seen it, but we finally saw it work. We saw what happens when you take that approach with actual good defenders. And it should be frightening for City and City fans, because it negates their two best players and completely takes them out of the game. So it's your move, Pep, to figure out how to combat that. And the best way to do it may be going against everything you know and giving up a little bit of that possession. And yes, you'll expose the back line a little bit, but it's going to open the game up for your two best players and give them some actual scoring opportunities, because 72% possession did not do it. That's my thoughts on it. It was a good game. I don't really care if you found it entertaining or not. It was dramatic. It's a 0-0 draw, but it was still incredibly dramatic. It was tight, and it opened up the Premier League. It is Liverpool's season to lose, and we still have an incredibly tight race with a month and change to go. So you got to love this race. You got to love the way this is shaping up. And I'm sorry if you weren't entertained by the game, but frankly, I don't really care. That's how the teams and the really good managers in the world chose to play it. So get in that comment section. Let me know what you think about the tactics, about the strategy, about the way it was played, about the way the season's shaping up. Liverpool, Arsenal, Manchester City, doesn't matter. Get in that comment section and let me hear your voice. Make sure you hit that subscribe button for us down below. And of course, if you don't already, follow us on Twitter at PitchsidePub. Thanks as always for joining us here on La Pausa, a Pints and Punditry podcast at the Pitchside Pub.